Many Republicans no longer support aid for Ukraine, but is the obstruction of aid to Ukraine being driven by a few radicals at the behest of former President Donald Trump, or is there a wider lack of strong support for Ukraine within a highly polarized GOP? Does Ukraine need to go beyond Washington, D.C. to ensure US support and reach out to middle America? This is the sort of challenging idea I read in a recent article by Jason J. Smart. I thought it'd be fantastic to get him on the channel. He's one of the strongest pro-Ukrainian voices, and of course is an experienced political advisor who is now living and working in Ukraine. He has also worked in Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Latin America. Due to his work within the democratic opposition to Vladimir Putin, Smart was made persona non grata for life by Russia in 2010. Jason is now special correspondent at the Kyiv Post and is a managing partner at American Political Sciences. It is various themes from his recent articles in the Kyiv Post that we will be discussing in this episode. Before we get into it, please like, subscribe, add a comment, let us know what you think of the videos. Do please share them around so other people can find the fantastic guests on the channel, and do also check out the validated charities, the Ukrainian charities that you will see in the description of the video. It is now more important than ever to help support Ukrainian resilience and resistance to Russian aggression. Jason, welcome to the channel.
Thank you so much.
Well, let's start with that first line there, really about US sort of internal politics that is affecting aid to Ukraine, and then we'll sort of turn to other topics of which I'm sure we won't get to cover everything. But I think those obstructions to the US aid for Ukraine, it's an interesting question as to whether this is the result of a few radicals, assets, or agents within the US, or is this a wider problem that Ukraine has failed to reach out to middle America? It's failed to explain, for instance, why supporting Ukraine creates jobs in Ohio and aligns with US values. I'd love to know what you think.
So ultimately, there's several reasons that Ukraine support has stalled in the U.S. And I would, obviously Speaker Johnson gets the lion's share of the attention, but there's a lot of attributes to this. How do we get to today's point? How do we go from just 2 years ago, where the vast majority of Americans, over 80%, supported aid for Ukraine? Today, that number is much lower. It is over 50%. It's probably about 56% according to recent polling. But why is it, though, that it has changed? And so I think that we can look at that. So there's one attribute, which is the messaging. I think that the White House was weak in the messaging on this. The average American, especially those that tend to vote Republican, were not clear as to why Ukraine was important to their strategic interest. They're not clear on the different aid packages. And if you look back at the various aid packages that the U.S. passed or that the U.S. decided to send, there wasn't a lot of messaging on why that aid package was so important. Why this sum of money now? Why these weapons now? There should have been more explanation. I think that would have helped a lot where people understood that this was not stacks of cash being sent to Ukraine. I think there's definitely this understanding that it was crates of money just disappearing off to Ukraine. It was never the case. There's another attribute of this, which is, of course, what is occurring domestically in the U.S. Ukraine is very associated at this point with Biden. Donald Trump's history with Ukraine was one of his two impeachments. And it was related, of course, specifically to his offer to send support to Ukraine in exchange for Zelensky providing evidence against Hunter Biden. So there is a whole backstory to this of why Democrats might be more favorable to Ukraine or Republicans less favorable. At the same time, I think that the average person, or at least not even average person, the people in Congress, the Republicans in Congress, who are hijacking what is happening and preventing a vote from occurring, are the same people who forced out Speaker McCarthy just a few months ago. Speaker McCarthy, as you recall, was a Republican. He put forward a bill on Ukraine, and for that, they put through the motion to vacate the speakership, and he was taken out. Unfortunately, and this is a true loss for Ukraine, is that the Democrats all voted in favor of that. So Speaker Johnson, if he were tomorrow to put a vote to Ukraine to the floor, there's a very good chance that those same MAGA Republicans would move to vacate the speaker again. And why should Speaker Johnson assume that the Democrats despite the fact that this is occurring specifically because he's helping Ukraine. Why should you assume the Democrats would vote not to force him out? There's a good chance that would happen. And so there's a lot of different problems that came down the road and have affected support for Ukraine and the lack of current aid coming to Ukraine.
And that use of, I would say, foreign policy, of external politics and security within the sort of internal positioning in US politics, is that been going on for decades, or is this a relatively new and highly sort of polarized behavior that we're seeing here?
It's not new. Unfortunately, it is a risk to U.S. national security, and it's a very dangerous game that's being played. That should be very clear. I think that it's quite unfortunate the U.S. has reached this point where our strategic interests are going to be jeopardized due to really just small bands in the parties who are opposed to what is rational to everybody else. And it's something that, as time goes on, I think will probably worsen in the U.S. As it's become more and more delineated. I mean, for instance, we look at what's going on with aid for Israel as another example. There is obviously some in the Democratic Party who've been very outspoken against Israel or in favor of Hamas. That's, of course, a minority of the party. But do they have pull? Well, yes. I mean, they definitely are able to influence things. And we see the size of the protests that they have had in the United States about these issues. So this is true in any political party. Unfortunately, I think at this point, the Republican Party has not been able to control these radical MAGA supporters who are willing to, I would say, burn everything down a la Trump style because they think that's a better way of creating a future. They think it's going to create a disaster for Biden. And by creating a disaster for Biden, that's going to be beneficial to Trump in the general elections, which I question. I actually don't believe that would be the case. But either way, this is something that we see continuing to be a problem and it will be for the rest of this election year.
And for those who are in what now feels like a bit of a Ukrainian bubble, even in the UK, which doesn't, it's not using this issue as a political football at all, and nonetheless, many people have disconnected. And even those who know, have been doing the channel and so on, they'll say, oh, so that's still going on, or what's happened there? Because you don't see it in the news anymore. But if you're inside the Ukrainian bubble, you see on an almost daily basis extraordinary, terrible images of suffering, of Russian aggression, of callousness towards civilians. I'm thinking in particular of the drone attack against the apartment block in Odessa and the horrific images of small children buried under the rubble, in one instance killed with their parents. These are deeply harrowing and images that raise extreme anger, I think, in those that are pro-Ukrainian. But are these images getting through to the bulk of people? Are they actually being shown in the media? And are conclusions being drawn from them?
So it's a good question. So this is sort of a political technology question, I guess, more than a journalism question. But so I'll answer it in that context. No, I don't think it effectively gets through for a couple of reasons. One, at this point, I think that the population's tolerance level for seeing violent images or seeing bombed out buildings is very high. They've seen a lot of them over 2 years. So I don't know if it really shocks people anymore. The shock of it has disappeared. It's worn off. At this stage, it's no longer as tragic, let's say, in the eyes of people that see it. It's just another day. That's always what happens in Ukraine. And I think that they simply, it's discounted. It's not taken to something that will really move them in any way. But if we look more specifically, why is that Americans that don't support Ukraine, why they don't support Ukraine, it's also very interesting. It's a very small percentage of people that support Russia in the United States. Only about 7% of Americans have a positive opinion of Russia. So it's a very small percentage. Those who don't support more aid for Ukraine generally do it because of economics reasons. They simply say that, listen, it's too much money. Now, to put this in comparison, the aid for Ukraine last year worked out to about 5.5% of the Pentagon's total budget. So if we consider the fact that we're able to destroy 50% of Russia's tanks, hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers, it's a very good return on investment for the U.S. as a national security question that we are able to defeat Russia so cheaply. I mean, less than 6% of the Pentagon's budget. That's not the U.S. national budget. That's the Pentagon's. So it's far less than 1% of the U.S.'s total budget. And yet there's people who say, well, that's so much money. Because you look at the numbers, you say $63 billion, It sounds like a ton of money. It is huge, let's be honest. At the same time, if you put it into comparison as to what that is for the US and what our other expenditures are, it's really not that much. That's sort of, that's not really accurate. So I think that Americans need to understand where the money's going, as I said earlier, and to understand the justification for why it's important, why that helps America, how many jobs are created by this, the fact that all the aid that is sent to Ukraine, almost all of it, is produced in the United States. And more to that end, most of it was used. It was not new. We're not, making new things to send to Ukraine. Rather, we are sending Ukraine the hand-me-downs from the US, and the US eventually produces new things for its own self. So this has been positive. It's very cheap, and obviously it has a very large return on investment.
And of course, positive impact on jobs, which is not been communicated. I mean, we see very positive economic figures coming out of the US, but somehow the link isn't made between those. Is there another problem as well? And given your sort of dual experience in both political technology and, of course, the media, do we have another issue here, which is a so-called Moscow lens, whether conscious or unconscious? That is, the media falls into certain narratives, certain narrative structures. Sometimes you could even call them narrative traps, which is, when Moscow is sort of losing ground, as they massively did in 2022, it's not covered in quite the same detail as when Ukraine loses ground incrementally. There seems to be a disbalance in the way the two, actions on the ground are interpreted and communicated.
Absolutely, I totally agree with that. I think there is definitely a bias, and it's a bias that's sort of extraordinary, and it's hard to really fathom that Americans, I should say, decision makers in America, policymakers, have such this deep interest in Russia, this belief that it's this very strong country. I think it's due to its physical size. There's this total misunderstanding that it means it's a very strong country, and it does harken back to the Soviet Union, when in fact it was a very strong country and had much greater influence. Today, Russia is simply not the Soviet Union. Their economy before the war, before the sanctions, was smaller than the size of Italy's. They have incredible poverty in their country. Life expectancy remains very, very low in Russia. The country is really quite broken. And we see that. We see in the military on the battlefield how poorly the Russians perform. This data that you see that, there's 4 Russians, 5 Russians dying for every Ukrainian, it does sound like a propaganda talking point. Trust me, I agree. But when you look into it, it seems like it's pretty accurate. The fact is, the Russians are just blowing through soldiers. They've wasted so much of what they had. Look at how much their reserves are of gold at this point, or euro, or Chinese yuan. They're burned right through it. Their economy is very unstable. And Russia, when it does advance, something takes a village. Look at Avdiivka, which they took last week. It was a village before the war that had 32,000 people. They've been trying to take Avdiivka for 10 years now. 10 years. This is a village of 32,000 before the war. This is nothing. And that's a great success for a country of 140 million people versus Ukraine, which the current population is unclear due to immigration and refugees. But, there's solidly at least probably 13, 14 million people who are outside the country or underneath Russian occupation. So if you consider this, Ukraine's population, let's say it's 25 million. So 25 million versus 140 million. And the Russians, it took 10 years to take a village. I wouldn't say the Russians are doing particularly well. I would say it's a tremendously poor result. It's a disastrous result. And there's 2 reasons to attribute this. Outside of the fact that Russia itself is a disaster and the Russian military is. On the Ukrainian side, they've had morale is very, very high. The Ukrainian soldiers are fighting on home turf for their land, for their people, and they're completely determined to do so. The Russian side is simply not, and we've seen that. Secondly, the technology that was given to Ukraine by the West has been instrumental. It has saved tons of Ukrainian lives. When you're compare a javelin to the Soviet tanks that they're using, or you compare the HIMARS, which has had incredible results, it's day and night. There's nothing similar to it that the Russians have. And that is why Russia continues to lose when, you would think it should be winning. No, it can't. It just doesn't have the ability to stand up against this technological advanced military that Ukraine has, thanks to assistance from the West.
And you've touched upon one of the extraordinary propagandistic narratives, which seems to crop up even in mainstream media, and that is that Western weapons will not make a difference on the battlefield in Ukraine. I think famously amongst foreign policy circles, Samuel Charap floated this one around the time of the full-scale invasion. And it's a clear propagandistic line here that tries to discourage the supply of advanced Western technology in the guise that it won't make any difference and it may escalate things. Simon Jenkins writes today about Taurus, again using the word escalation. And I think, in my view, where you see those two put together with Western weapons won't work and they're escalatory, well, they can't both be true. And yet these still do resurface in the media. I mean, I'm deeply suspicious of this, if not paranoid. Should I be? I mean, is this the result of just people being useful idiots or ill-informed, or is it more pernicious than that? Should we perhaps see Russian narratives seeded within the media, or possibly even sort of assets or agents at work to undermine support for Ukraine?
So I guess we can put that in two different sections. So the first thing is, yes, it is obviously a completely false and absurd argument that we should not arm Ukraine. The facts speak for themselves. I mean, 2 years, Ukraine has taken back tremendous tracts of territory that the Russians had immediately seized in February and March 2022. And that is thanks to, one, the resolve, but secondly, also the weapons from the West. And the people who said that Kyiv would fall in 3 days in DC are still in their positions. They didn't get fired, they didn't get shuffled out, and that's disastrous. But we see that there's this huge problem that America has with calculating morale, not just in Ukraine. Look at Afghanistan when it collapsed. The Americans totally got it wrong as to how the troops of Afghanistan were they willing to fight or not. What would happen? And obviously they miscalculated that quite badly. But today, I think those in DC who have this bias that escalation will create a problem is just it's patently false. One, Russia has no capacity to respond to something else. Listen, if they cannot take the village after 10 years, what do you think they're going to do? Attack New York? You think they're going to invade the UK? It's so absurd. It just doesn't make any sense. It literally does not make sense. And that's why I think that when we look at the instability that Russia has, moreover, not just militarily, economically, politically at this point as well. Remember what Prigozhin did just last summer with the Wagner Group when he tried to roll up to Rostov. There's a lot of serious fundamental errors in Russia in the construction of how everything is set up, which will eventually lead to serious destabilizing events, hopefully sooner than later. But in the short term, I think that we do get it wrong, those in the West that are looking at the situation. But what is their motivation? So I think there's one, a bias, a very deep bias. Most people who are studying the region, whether it's the Caucasus or Central Asia, or it's the Eastern Slavic countries, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, typically did start off studying Russia. So there is a strong bias in favor of studying Russia. Also, there's a generational issue. I think that people who were informed, who were educated in the Soviet Union, that is during the period that there's still a Soviet Union, have a bias that will not go away, that Soviet Union is the world's second greatest country. It's massive, it has incredible power, it can do incredible things. It's simply not the case anymore. But those who are the students of those professors also have that same bias. Because let's be fair, the perspective that you were taught was, Russia is this very strong country, it behaves this way, it does this. And the rest of the countries in the rest of the republics of the Soviet Union were sort of ignored. We're going to say, frankly, pretty much ignored. Very little note was made about them. But we see that's a huge error. Look what's happening now in Kazakhstan. Look what's happening now with Azerbaijan and Armenia. Look what's, there's a lot going on in the region. Russia does have a huge influence, but it does not call all the shots. It does not get to make all the decisions. And so we rather than face the fact that Russia, if it is forced into a position, that is to say, we say we're going to give weapons, and what will you do about it? The fact is, they won't do anything about it. I mean, they've already issued how many red lines at this point, and all of it means nothing. I mean, Russians have shown that it's all talk. They simply do not have the capacity, the wherewithal to do more. And so I think that at this point, if we were strategically wise, we'd understand allowing the downfall of the Putin regime would be something that would pay dividends for the United States and for the West as a whole for years to come. But we see that Western decision makers are afraid that if the Crimean Kerch Bridge is struck that connects Crimea to mainland Russia, that will destabilize Russia, or it'll be an escalation. Or when there's attacks in Belgrade by Ukraine, they say, oh my God, they blew up an oil depot. Again, this is terrible. This is going to destabilize Russia. When Ukrainian troops, I should say, when Russians fighting the Ukrainian army went to Belgrade and the neighboring oblast of Russia last summer and rolled around for a couple of days. That was, I think the Americans probably almost, had a heart attack about it. They were very worried this was going to destabilize Russia. But what's the risk? What's going to happen? What can Russia realistically do? We've done all this already. There's been drone strikes by Ukraine across Russia. And what does Russia do in response? Nothing more than what it's currently doing. So
It kills
Ukraine has,
civilians. I mean, it strikes
well,
civilian targets, but it doesn't do military, or it has little capacity to respond militarily. Is that correct?
no, yes, I mean, to the West. I mean, what it can do to Ukraine is one thing, but what it can do to the West, I mean, the fear is we cannot give ATACMS, for instance, to Ukraine, because if they get ATACMS, they'll definitely strike Crimea. And if Crimea falls, or, Ukraine is able to liberate Crimea, that will lead to this destabilizing event where the Russian military might collapse, or XYZ could occur. And based upon that, we cannot give ATACMS. Well, that's absurd. I mean, that's stupid. The fact is, we're forcing Ukrainians to get closer to the zero line, get closer to combat, risk their lives, because we don't want to give them tools that allow them to shoot from further distance because of this hypothesis that it might destabilize Russia. Prove the hypothesis. It makes no sense.
And if Russia is going to destabilize, and it's not a guarantee that it will, but the situation that Putin is creating for a long attritional war, moving to a war economy, high rates of inflation. He's creating all sorts of instability, potentially, the longer and longer the war drags on. So quite apart from the absurd logic of not wanting to escalate, dragging it out seems to actually increase the kind of very risks we're worried about. But at the same time, what could the US do about that? Is it perhaps an overestimate of the influence that we could have if Russia does descend into a more chaotic phase of its history? There's little, if anything, perhaps we could do to prevent that or to lessen the severity of it.
And the reality is that Russia, I have 0% fear of a destabilized Russia. And I don't think that there's a reason that you should fear it. Let's remember, the United States, or the West, I should say, or Ukraine, has to execute what it is in its national security interest. In this case, the national security interest is to prevent Russia's invasion of a sovereign nation, which thereby would prevent future invasions of other sovereign nations, and not just only in Russia, but obviously looking towards Taiwan and other issues. So it is very much in our interest that we really, put our foot down and we show that we're serious about this. But to quote General Ben Hodges, since when it is our job to worry how Putin will react or what he will think, that shouldn't be our consideration. Our consideration is what is good for us, what is good for America, what is good for the West. It is not what is good for Vladimir Putin. And if that destabilizes his regime, well, that should probably be a lesson not to invade countries again.
And another narrative that seems to be underplayed, and this is one of the reasons really why I set the channel up 2 years ago, was to focus on Ukrainian innovation. Now, primarily, I was originally focused on innovation in the information space and in combating disinformation and propaganda. But it does seem that Ukrainians are extraordinarily adept at innovating military technology, tactics, and strategies as well. We see yet another ship of the Black Sea Fleet taken out, a very recent corvette, I think, a 2021 production ship produced in the Kerch shipyards. And it comes off the back of an extraordinary series of success, which is based on an innovation in technology and tactics, which are delivering incredible gains. Ukraine has no navy, and yet it is taken out, I think it's now a quarter or a fifth of the entire Black Sea Fleet. Why do we underplay that? Why do we not focus on things like sea drone innovations, on Ukraine developing its own MRAPs, the FPV drone tactics and technology that are advancing, it seems, month on month? What is it about this that is not attractive in the media? Does it perhaps counter an archetype of Ukraine being the victim? Therefore, how can you write about it being resilient, innovative, fighting back, that kind of thing?
I think they should publish in the media as much as they can. The fact is, there is hope that Ukraine can win. I think that unfortunately, the narrative that we see more in the overall press, I would say, is that Ukraine's not getting weapons, and so it's losing territory, which is not inaccurate, but it's also overemphasizing the point. Yes, it is a difficult situation. That is undoubtedly the case. But to behave as if Ukraine now is just putting its hands up and begging the Russians don't kill us while we wait for the American Congress to pass more aid, it's just totally false. I mean, in the last 2 weeks, they've shut down like 13 or 14 airplanes. This is just amazing successes. Ukraine's, in the course of war, has not shot down that many airplanes in such a short period of time. The number of ships that it's sunk, yes, it's quite a large number now of the Black Sea Fleet that has disappeared. This is really tremendous. This morning, another oil depot in Russia was blown up by Ukraine. So Ukraine is having a lot of successes, and it's having successes that I don't think that many people in the West are familiar with or that they know of. And one of the reasons I think they're having these successes, though, is that Ukraine is thinking outside the box. The Soviet military, I should say the Russian military, has a very Soviet mentality still. It's very top down. It's got a lot of problems internally, as I said. But one of the things that Ukraine has benefited from is the huge influx of people that were mobilized or volunteered 2 years ago that came from the private sector. And I think this is actually sort of interesting. And I've spoken with a lot of Ukrainians who said this too, is that when you come from the private sector, formerly you'd worked at, let's say, Google, or you'd worked at, an international corporation, you come to it with this sort of, corporate ideology, but also you're very open to new ideas. If you have a Western education and you study in the West, academic settings in the West is very much so open to new ideas and exploring different things and seeing where it goes. Soviet mentality was the opposite. It was you take orders. And that's why when you meet people who used to work in the Soviet military or Soviet intelligence, they're not very creative. They're not really big into things such as finding innovative ways to do things. They're very much into fulfilling orders. Whereas the Ukrainian side has to think outside the box. Just by population, it's impossible for it to play the same game. A war of attrition doesn't work out well for Ukraine. Look at the size of the populations. So the only way that they can win is with this think outside this box. And that's what they're doing with attacking the Russian Navy as much as they have, shoot down the airplanes, the attacks within Russia, the Belgorod People's Republic per se, they created last summer. All these different things have been very effective because it really has put Russia on its heels, and it makes Russia then invest resources into trying to cover up things or to cover for things that they had not anticipated or that they had no game plan for. So that's why it really gives us a unique ability to do something different.
Another media trap which is fairly common, and I say this as a broad brush because, of course, there are incredible journalists out there doing in-depth work, but another broad trap of the mainstream media is to focus on personalities. And this is where I saw quite a lot of commonality between the Western press and indeed the Russian oppositional media like TV Rain on two particular stories. One is Navalny, and the other one is the covering of the story of the so-called dispute between President Zelensky and of course his general Zaluzhny, and when his dismissal came, it was all about the personalities. There was very little of strategy there. It was almost reduced, I would say, to the level of gossip. As we
I,
see now with the passage of time, it's probably not going to have a huge impact. In fact, we're seeing continuing Ukrainian success strategically.
I agree. I mean, listen, it was, I don't oppose the shakeup. And I think most people recognize is probably a positive in the end. It's unfortunate. I agree with you. The reporting in the West was mostly sort of gossipy. It was mostly, he said this, they feel this. And all that's, I think, ultimately sort of irrelevant. Did that really affect the change, or was there real serious policy differences or different ideas? Zelensky himself had said in a number of interviews that one, he thought it was sort of a stalemate, that maybe new eyes need to look at the problem. So he already signaled that he was perhaps ready to take a break. And we've seen that did it upset the whole cart? No, it didn't. But it is very unfortunate the press did sort of boil down just to fighting. Now, I do think there's a reason for this. I think that one, human interest, people click those stories more. But secondly, I think that that is something that Russian propaganda does push. Russian propaganda does push a number of different narratives that we hear. And what's I think very important about Russian propaganda, that Russian, I should say, actually active measures, not even propaganda, when they're actively trying to cause events in foreign countries, they do sometimes create their own new ideas or new organizations, but more often they sort of hijack what's already existing. So if they were looking at the United States, just as an example, they would look for this pushing a narrative that Ukraine is too expensive. We have our own expenses. So Putin himself said it, Tucker Carlson, you guys have a huge debt. Why are you possibly going to go waste more money in Ukraine? Don't you guys want to worry about your border? This is what Putin said to Tucker Carlson. He didn't just think of that on the spot. That was the points he knew he had to deliver during the speech, and those were talking points. So Putin delivered that because he thought, actually knows, that data in the United States shows that does dissuade American voters from supporting Ukraine. So when we go to this question, though, about the general, I think that would be a very effective argument for Russia to push, is that, look, it's all due to, petty, not even politics, but gossipy stuff. That is the reason that the general is being replaced. The general who everybody loves and respects is getting canned because he doesn't get along well with the chief of staff of the president. Well, that's all nonsense. I mean, frankly, that is nonsense. But secondly, that's what Russia wants you to believe, though. And why does it want you to believe that? Because if I'm a soldier, how disheartening that must be to think that now the guy who we all esteem is going to get kicked out, and he really cared about me and my well-being, and he's going to be replaced by God knows whoever, who's just going to treat us as meat. Of course, that's going to be disheartening for the soldiers. So I think Russia does try to push that, and we know that. We know that Russia does push that. I had a meeting actually earlier today with the Office of Strategic Communication and Information Security, called STRATCOM, of Ukraine, and we were discussing this. What are the narratives that Russia pushes in Ukraine? And they push a lot of narratives, but it's mostly that, listen, look at all the weapons that Ukraine has. Look at all the Shaheeds it's got from Iran. Look from all these bullets it got from North Korea, which is all accurate. But Russia pushes it and really emphasizes it, even in the Ukrainian language propaganda they do, because they say the Americans have abandoned you. The West has abandoned you. Make a deal now and get out. Just surrender. Just surrender. It's hopeless. You're resisting what is inevitable. And they push that. Why? Because they want the population to lose heart. Russia is very effective in how it operates.
And of course, they have form. This stuff works. They were able to overturn the popular uprising in Belarus through exactly deploying this kind of stuff, not by saying, we know you're in the opposition and you're wrong, we're right, but rather far more sneakily saying, well, we're the bad guys and we know where you're coming from, but you're not going to win because we're vicious and we're tough and no one supports you. And, it's that fairly underhand sort of way of demoralizing people. And that's one of the big pushes of propaganda, both internally, isn't it? But also very much in Western partners, which is to discourage action, to sow, not indifference, but a sense of helplessness.
So there's been studies about this. What is effective messaging in terms of propaganda? And one of the things that you learn is that it's actually quite difficult to persuade someone of something the opposite from what they believe, right? So if I am a great patriot to say, it's you should become a patriot of Russia now, it's not going to happen probably. Okay, it's going to be a very, very uphill battle. But what you can do is create doubts. Creating doubts in people is much easier. The famous example is the cigarette companies in the United States who paid for a couple of studies back in the 60s when cigarette smoke was found to contain carcinogenics. That they published a few studies or sponsored studies that said, well, there's a lot of doubt if really that's true. And why do they do this? Because when you pump out to the population, listen, there's a lot of mixed science on this. Yes, some say it has carcinogenics, but others say they're not really sure. So really, it's unclear if cigarettes cause cancer. This to the smoker gives a justification to continue smoking because, well, maybe it really won't hurt me. Maybe the science isn't settled on this and I'm not risking anything. So there's a reason to try to create doubts. You can't convince them that cigarettes are good for you. It would be very hard to convince people of that. But that maybe it's not so bad for you is an easier target. And so I think in the case of Ukraine, it's, they're not going to convince anyone to like Russia, because trust me, there's not a lot of support for Russia. But to convince them that, listen, you've gotten screwed over by your foreign allies. They've kicked you down the road. You're on your own now, and they're just going to mobilize more and more soldiers, and you're going to lose your loved ones, or you can cut a deal now, and everything goes back the way it was before, and your lives will be just great. That's why they push that narrative because it's effective. Fortunately, we don't see those results. I don't see anyone in the streets protesting in the war, but I do see that the logic for why Russia pushes those narratives.
And as far as you're concerned, is there any distinction between people who are consciously pushing Kremlin-inspired narratives or those who are, useful idiots or perhaps people who are confirmed in their own worldview. It could be a fairly academic or abstract worldview that doesn't relate back to reality, but they'll defend it come what may. To you, does it actually matter, where in that spectrum they fit, if they're pushing Russian narratives? Or is it quite important actually to understand the distinctions so we can take their narratives apart? There's also the role of people who are clearly, have some kind of grift or deep self-interest. And I throw the names of, Tucker Carlson and Arestovich in there as well, where to me it's not clear where they are in terms of those categorizations, but it is possible to pick out Kremlin-inspired narratives in some of their output.
So it's a really good question. So motivation is always very hard to tell, and that's why I usually try not to attribute motivation to somebody's actions, because ultimately in the end it's very complicated. But we can only speak for the actions that they take themselves. That's much more clear. And so I think that well, as I said, Russia likes to hijack already existent narratives. So in the case of people like Americans who are saying that our national debt is too high, it's very rational that they would then say, and that's why we shouldn't finance the war in Ukraine. And that makes perfect sense. I mean, it's a logical conclusion to come to if you start with that premise. And so they push it. So I don't think that every person in America who says, we can't afford it is doing it because Putin wants them to do that. I think that there's a very strong contingent of Americans who are concerned about our massive national debt. It's what, $33 trillion or so now. So there's a legitimate concern. There's a legitimate reason to be concerned. But once again, that is not something that Russia itself created. Russia is simply using what is already there to its benefit. Likewise, I think that if we look at, George Galloway, for instance, something like this, there are people who are on the left who are getting
I was going
sponsored.
to mention him as well, just to have balance there between a vatnik from every single country.
Yeah, there's one for every country. Now, in his case, he's a pathetic human being. But beside that, he is a person who I think does drop in the issues. I don't think he sincerely believes it. And I think that's sort of the fascinating part is I think a lot of these people in their heart of hearts understand that. Tucker Carlson, we know full well from the lawsuits he's had in the United States that he thinks that Donald Trump's an idiot. I mean, he said that. He's written to people. He can't stand to talk to him. He can't stomach being around him. And yet you would think he's the number one Trump supporter. But his text messages in the lawsuits have showed that he personally despises Donald Trump. So how's that give? Because he doesn't care. I mean, this is just a role he's playing, and he's trying to get as many clicks as he can. We see this very often. We often talk about Orban in Hungary, and I have a radical view about Orban, which is different than most people. I think that Orban, I think he definitely has some sympathies for Russia, but I think it's not the motivation he has. If you look at the polling numbers in Hungary, he's got strong support, extremely strong support. And the reason he has extremely strong support, if you look at the polling numbers, is because he says, I'm fighting for Hungary and not for the Europeans. I'm not doing what another country's interest, I'm doing what is Hungary's interest. And what's fascinating is that it's not like this is Hungary's money that's going somewhere. Hungary receives money from the European Union, but he is doing this because for the domestic audience, it looks really good. And I think that's what motivates him. It's ultimately that more than anything else, because it's been a plus for him. Look at his numbers. It's not that the Hungarians love Russians. They don't. 1956 was a very bad year in their relations. And that's something they still talk about today. And he still talks about today, by the way. But it's something that they realize that we can still manipulate, because this is not, the narrative is not, we are fighting Russia. It is, we are not going to be forced by the Europeans to give up what would be the subsidies that Europe sends to us to give it to Ukraine. The subsidies should go to Hungary. And that's what this argument's about in the eyes of Orban. How do I make myself the man who's defending Hungary, not the man who's defending Russia? And that's the way that Hungarians view it, and hence why what he does works for him, at least so far, in Europe.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we see flavors of, my country first politics. There's America first, and that, of course, has some terrible connotations in the 1930s as well. But there's America first movement, which broadly MAGA is. You've got Orban's Hungary, and those points of view seem to be, you cannot be pro-Ukraine or pro-funding for Ukraine and aligned with that. We also have a kind of UK first in the sort of Brexity Tory party. But that does seem able to balance, like you can be that thing, you can be Britain first, but you can also support Ukraine. So it's not always the case that these, nativist type political messaging are mutually exclusive with Ukrainian support.
Absolutely the case. I mean, the fact is, I think it depends on who's driving the narrative at that moment. I mean, nativist movements tend to, rise, as you're well enough aware, when the economy is in retraction, and also when there's a large increase of, say, migrants, or things like this that are viewed as a threat to your ability to get a job. This is where you see the strongest. Now, when it goes to other things like there's economic distress, a lot of migrants, and then we're not going to have any more jobs because we're more interested in some other foreign issue. It's very easy to distract voters with that. And you're right. I mean, pre-World War II, United States was dominated by that. We know very well that there was a group that in Congress, Republicans, who opposed supporting the UK and our allies because they were worried that, well, why does this war have to do with us? It won't reach us as long as we stay away from this. And history showed that was a mistake. And ultimately, I think that if we look at what motivates people, and if you really ask them, why is it you oppose it? And I said, we have to help America first, or we have to put our countries first. So it's really not against Ukraine. And the logic they gave was not that, Russia's doing a good thing. Very few people probably argue that. I mean, serious people. I think there's many more people that would simply say, and it's based out of fear, very important attribute. I'm scared about the situation in our country. It is out of control, and nobody's doing anything to fix it. And so this is not a time to focus on somebody else's problems. It's a fire in my neighbor's house, but there's a bigger fire going on in my house.
Yeah, I mean that's an effective piece of political messaging, whether it has something in reality. And I think even to those who are not in that movement, it can still trickle down. So this is an extraordinary piece of research that you quote in one of your articles, and that is 1 in 10 Europeans only 1 in 10 Europeans believe that Ukraine can win the war against Russia. And this could be classified as the politics of limited possibility. People are not seeing the possibilities of victory. Whereas 87% of Ukrainians, these are people in the trenches, in the firing lines, who are coming under attack in their apartments and streets. 87% of them believe in victory. And I think it's interesting to deconstruct the Ukrainian word for victory, перемога, which essentially is exceeding the possible, exceeding the sort of your current capabilities or what you thought was possible. So there's an extraordinary sort of gap there in mindset. And my point of view is that is why we should be focusing on Ukraine, because that idea of a victory you didn't believe was possible could be an extraordinarily motivating factor, even outside of the context of the war that we're discussing.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And speaking about war games and stuff they do in the West, where they get it wrong is I think it asked the wrong question. As we discussed, they're always worried about escalation, but they never ask, and what would happen if we allow Putin to take the Ukraine? What happens then? And really, it doesn't come up. When you look at all the war games that have been done, the parts that have been made public, they don't ask that. So what comes next? I mean, what would he do if he takes this part of the country, takes the whole country? What does that mean next? That question is not asked nearly enough. And the fact is, Russia is an existential threat to a number of countries. With its allies, such as obviously Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Nicaragua, China, there's a lot of damage that can be done to a number of countries around the world. And I think that we have to ask this question: what will happen if we are not responsible and put Russia in its place now? That's really the primary question. And second to that, if we look at the overall situation of Ukraine, the country is fighting. It is having successes. Europeans, for some reason, don't believe that it's going to result in victory. But which is sort of funny because if we look at the internal situation to Russia, the country, as I said, is highly destabilized. So my hypothesis from the very beginning of this war, well, probably month 2 of the war, was that the way that the war would end is not going to be Ukraine physically liberating all the territory on the battlefield, but rather it was going to be that Russia is not going to be able to fight any longer, that it's going to wish to no longer be in the war. And why would that happen? It's obviously not going to be a change of heart from Mr. Putin. Much more probable, I think, is that there will be either an economic destabilizing event, political destabilizing event, or military destabilizing event within Russia. So it can be something as hyperinflation. It could be a military event such as Prigozhin, another unit of Wagner, deciding to try to ride to Moscow. It could be something political. I mean, there's a lot of oligarchy in Russia. They realize that Putin is already in his 70s. At some point, he will die. Even if you like him, he will die. But those competing oligarchies realize that when someone takes his place, they're going to liquidate all the opposing parts of the oligarchy who Putin was able to balance. And that's sort of what's kept him in power, is that there's different clans, different groups fighting in Moscow, but Putin is the centerpiece. And he's the linchpin that makes sure that they don't create a civil war. But without him, it's not so clear that would happen. But if you know that he is going to eventually die, your group is most likely to get liquidated. It would be strategically very wise at this point to be the one that pulls the trigger on him to make sure that you're able to coup and take power before an opposing faction takes over, which would lead to your own demise.
So this could be setting up for considerable kind of chaos, which could be beneficial, highly beneficial to Ukraine. Isn't also linked to this idea that by failing to really understand these undercurrents of power within Russia and these power relations, we also fail perhaps to also understand the primary objectives of Ukraine's, why Ukraine came under attack by Russia, not because of NATO expansion and all this stuff we hear through propagandistic channels, but the primary objective to control Ukraine, to change the regime, to repress its culture, to stifle that sort of innovation and, the Maidan, the sort of chaotic democracy of Maidan, which very much threatens the Russian vertical system. If we fail to understand the motives and objectives of the war, which perhaps have not changed too much, then we fail to put forward an appropriate strategy to counter it.
I agree totally with you. I mean, the fact is that it's imperialistic in nature and it wishes to expand. It is not limited to only to Ukraine. And we can see what Russia has done with parts of the country have been under occupation for a decade, like the Donbass, the Donetsk, Lugansk. They didn't rebuild anything there. They've destroyed a lot that was there. Even the mines. I mean, there's been stories about how they ripped out the structuring inside of the mines for the scrap metal, rather than make them work. They have no interest. I mean, it's just really sort of stunning. And how many of the people there they've just sucked away and made them sent them off the meat grinder. Russia has no intention of making this, part of Russia in a serious sense. They wish to essentially subjugate Ukraine as a nation and to liquidate it as a state. And that's why it's simply impossible to negotiate with Russia, is that their view is that it needs to be destroyed. And that this is something that, until the rebellious Ukrainians are brought to order, it will pose a threat to Russia. But Putin also has his very own interest there. If you look at the initial regions that were invaded, there's a very strong corollary with what's located underneath the surface of the earth, which is, mineral resources, gas and things like this. Russia, I think when the war started, there was also having a hope that they would forever be able to dominate the European markets. And by making sure that Ukraine was not on the market or not be competitor to them, this would guarantee their own ability to have a monopoly.
But it hasn't, of course, quite worked out, although Russian grain is coming via Belarus. We haven't closed all of those loopholes. But coming back to negotiation, I think this is probably the sort of last area to focus on, because I know you've done a lot of media interviews today. It must be fairly exhausting. But this idea of negotiation, I think, is critical, because even now, we hear from those who are advising, key advisors within, national security apparatus within Washington, Jake Sullivan, others, they still refer back to diplomacy as being the ultimate solution and goal. We hear Olaf Scholz and some of his advisors also continually harking back to tough negotiations will eventually resolve this, diplomatic means. This imposition of our own sort of frameworks, our own values onto Russia seems to almost every Ukrainian I've spoken to be completely nonsensical. So will Ukraine fall for this and go down the route of a negotiation, or do they understand that it's an absolute red herring?
It is a red herring. And U.S. intelligence reports so far have said that Russia is not sincere in its desire to start negotiations. So the fact is, there's no negotiation to be made. And it's probably one of the narratives we probably hear the most in the West, in social media and other places. They say, well, Ukraine should just make a deal. It's a stalemate, everything's frozen, which is not exactly true. It's quite active. It's very hot right now. But it's not moving physically very far these boundaries. So just let Russia take what it has and, call it a day. It's flawed on several parts. As I said, the United States intelligence has been very clear that Russia has no sincere intention to negotiate as of yet. Secondly, we know that Russia, what it does to the people that are living under occupation. Zelensky talks about this often. It's not the territory that Ukraine is fighting for. It's the people that are living under occupation. There's over 90,000 open cases for sexual assault and rape in the Ukrainian prosecutor's office, filed by people who came from the occupied territories. The majority of which were against children. And when Russian soldiers were interrogated, they've said that the reason that children are targeted for sexual assault is because, quote, they don't run as fast. So I don't know how we could imagine the world where we'd say, let's abandon those citizens, let's abandon people who are relatives of the people living in free Ukraine. Let's abandon them all. I'm sorry, it's too bad. Putin gets to take them away now. And keep in mind, there's tens of thousands of Ukrainian children have been taken out of this country and shipped to Russia to Russify them. So they lose Ukrainian language, they lose Ukrainian heritage. And we know that because some of those kids do make their way out eventually, or to the West. And when they've made it out, they're very clear. I mean, they get brainwashed. They are told that they were being liberated, taken away from the parents who were a bad influence or bad things for them. And this is all part of Russia's larger plan to eradicate, to annihilate Ukraine as a nation state.
And of course, in the scenario where the contact line is frozen, I don't tend to believe that's how this will end, certainly based on our conversation and other conversations. But if that were to happen, then what is the likelihood there'll be justice? What is the likelihood that these children will be returned? What's the likelihood that Ukraine will actually get reparations for the extraordinary trauma, destruction, suffering that has been inflicted upon it?
Exactly right. I mean, the fact is that Vladimir Putin is up for the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, and those crimes are the abduction of children. So there's an international arrest warrant for the president of Russia because he steals Ukrainian children. If this is tolerable and normal behavior to somebody, that's profound. If they think that this is so simple as we'll just draw a line on a map and call it Russia, and this other side will call it Ukraine, and it'll all just get better, it's absolutely naive and foolish. I literally do not know of a single person who studies Russia who believes that. I mean, not a single person. It would be the equivalent if you said to a terrorist organization that has global plans that, well, listen, we'll let you just blow up a couple more buildings, but then just don't do it again. Well, the terrorist organization isn't interested in just a couple more buildings. Its objective is to inherently overturn the world order.
This is it. I think certain people like Bill Brown have been talking about Russia as a terrorist regime, even Khodorkovsky, for many years now. But we failed to listen, and despite all the evidence, we fail to act upon that. You remain confident. Last question. You remain confident in a Ukrainian victory, but can we say anything about how that will come about? And is there anything we should be doing in order to hasten that victory?
So there's a couple different streams of things occurring at the same time. One is that most analysis would argue that Ukraine can make significant advances, not in the next few weeks, but looking more about 8-9 months from now, that Ukraine can make significant advances to the east. I mean, that is, of course, dependent on the fact that they have the weapons necessary to defend their current lines and to wear down the Russian lines. And Russia doesn't have limitless numbers of tanks. It's all Soviet, I mean, almost all Soviet-made stuff. Plus, they also have reserves. They do not have the finances necessary to maintain this. So if we drag out Russia just a little longer, the data, economic data, the military data, would indicate that Russia will be forced to make some hard choices, such as leave Ukraine, which is the best choice for everybody, just because it's no longer able to. It doesn't have the capacity to continue administering this war in Ukraine. So I think that if there was going to be a significant military victory for Ukraine, it will probably be several months down the road, advancing east. And I think that ultimately the Russian military is brittle enough that it'll break. That is to say that once something like Crimea falls, I think the Russian military will start to collapse like it did in 1916, 1917. I think that's very realistic. And by the way, it's not my theory. This is doing interviews with US American generals who all believe this is probably what's going to happen based upon their own experience.
And of course, our fear of our leaders is Russia will then lash out at its enemies. Whereas again, history shows that it's far more likely to turn on its own people. And the 1930s style slide into terror, which is already accelerating, this isn't just imaginary, it's already there. They're far more likely to brutalize their own people, turn in on themselves. Is that, do you think, a sort of accurate assessment?
I think so. It's absolutely the case. And in Russia right now, Vladimir Putin's Russia is a dystopia. It is far more closed now as a society and as a government than even the 80s were under, say, Gorbachev. Gorbachev was quite liberal compared to Putin. The fact is the Soviet Union was totalitarian, but it's nothing compared to today's Putin's Russia. I mean, this is really tremendous. And if you look at the jail sentences they've handed out, they look at the number of assassinations they've carried out against their own population, the total evaporation of a free press. I mean, they've made so many websites illegal at this point. They've blocked so many things. trying to block VPNs now to avoid that their population knows of what's happening in the West. They have their equivalent of Facebook. It's called Vkontakte, and the other one's called Odnoklassniki. And in both cases, it's controlled by the FSB, so they can read everybody's messages, so that they can also monitor who's in, groups opposed to the government, or who's joining something such as the Nemtsov or the Alexei Navalny organization, or who's reading Rain Dozhd, which is an opposition news source. It's really well controlled. I mean, Telegram is also controlled by Russian intelligence. I mean, which is a very, very popular communications app in the country. Russia really has an incredible ability to control what is happening to its citizens, and I think that there will be more of that. And the fact that the country will eventually start to circle around and end up something like a red terror, I think it's already started.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us and your incredibly strong, welcome views on Ukraine. You've been there since the start, seeing things at first hand. Very much hope we get to talk again. But thanks so much on behalf of the channel for being on today.
Thank you for inviting me.